Okay, so picture this. You're all geared up, ready for a dive, that feeling of excitement building as you get ready to explore the underwater world. But as any diver knows, it's not just about jumping in, it's about having a solid plan, a dive profile that keeps you safe. And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We're going deep into these dive profiles using the source material you provided.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head about the plan because, there's more to it than just depth and how long you want to stay down there.
Right. It's like that classic saying, it's not the destination, it's the journey.
Exactly. And just like picking a hiking trail, you can have a bunch of different routes all ending at the same scenic viewpoint, but some might be, well, let's just say, a bit more treacherous than others.
So how does that translate to diving? I mean, most people focus on their bottom time and max depth, right?
Absolutely. Those are crucial, no doubt. But here's the thing. You could have two divers, same bottom time, same max depth, but their dives could be worlds apart in terms of risk, all because of the paths they take, those dive profiles.
So two divers, same depth, same time underwater. What makes the difference? You mentioned risk levels. What are we talking about here?
It all boils down to nitrogen.
Nitrogen, like the stuff that makes up, what, like 70% of the air we breathe?
The very same. The deeper you go, the more nitrogen your body absorbs. And here's the thing, it's not just about how much you take in, it's about how your body gets rid of it during your ascent.
So that's where the dive profile comes in.
You got it. Think of it like this. When you ascend too quickly, those nitrogen molecules in your body are like champagne bubbles. They want to come out of solution all at once, and that can cause problems, the bends we talked about.
Right, decompression sickness.
Yeah.
Not the souvenir you want to bring back from a dive trip.
Definitely not. And that's why a well-planned dive profile is crucial to manage that nitrogen absorption and release safely.
So we're not just talking about depth and time, but the actual path we take underwater, how we get there and back up again. It's like choosing between a leisurely stroll through a park
Yeah.
and sprinting up a flight of stairs. Both get you where you're going, but one is definitely easier on the body.
Now you're getting it. And thankfully, there are some tried and true dive profiles that can make those underwater journeys a whole lot safer.
So let's talk about these safer profiles. Your notes here mention a few different types, and I have to say, some sound a lot more appealing than others.
Well, that's the thing, right? Not all dive profiles are created equal. Your source material actually highlights 3 recommended profiles, and they're all about minimizing those rapid changes in pressure, giving your body time to adjust, kind of like easing into a hot bath instead of just jumping straight in.
Okay, so let's break these profiles down, starting with Profile A. What's the strategy there?
Profile A is all about smooth and steady. Imagine a nice gradual descent, taking your time to equalize, enjoy the scenery. Then you've got your bottom time, and then a nice controlled diagonal ascent back to the surface.
Okay, so no sudden movements, kind of like a scenic route versus taking the expressway.
Exactly. And this type of profile, it's really ideal for dives where you're planning on spending most of your time at a pretty constant depth, like around reefs and cliffs. It's all about minimizing that nitrogen buildup while maximizing your enjoyment.
Makes sense. Now, what about Profile B? How's that one different?
Profile B, it's also all about that slow, controlled diagonal descent and ascent. But here's the key. You're spending less than half of your no decompression limit at your max depth.
Less time hanging out at the deepest point. Got it. Now, before we move on to Profile C, I got to ask about this whole no decompression limit thing. I feel like we
Yeah.
hear that term thrown around a lot, but what does it actually mean for divers who might be listening who are still kind of new to all this?
That's a great question, and an important one, too. Your no decompression limit, it's essentially like a time limit for how long you can stay at a certain depth without needing to make any mandatory decompression stops on your way back to the surface. And it's based on a whole bunch of factors: the depth, how long you were down there, your breathing rate, even things like your overall fitness level.
So kind of like a personalized countdown timer for your dive
Yeah,
based on like a whole bunch of science-y calculations.
exactly. There are tables and these days dive computers that help us figure out those limits. But the important thing to remember is that it's a limit, not a target. Always better to stay well within it, just to be on the safe side.
Right, kind of like that fuel gauge in your car.
Yeah.
You don't want to push it to the absolute limit and risk running out at a crucial moment. It's a safety buffer.
Hmm.
All right, so we've got these more gradual profiles, A and B. What about Profile C?
Profile C, this one's a little different. Instead of that smooth diagonal, it involves what we call a vertical descent.
Vertical, so like straight down.
Yep, pretty much. You go straight down to your planned depth, spend your bottom time there, and then make what we call a stage descent back to the surface.
Stage descent.
Yeah.
Okay, so instead of a diagonal, it's more like climbing a set of stairs. When would you choose that kind of profile?
It's really handy when you're diving around underwater formations that kind of naturally have those stages. Like, imagine diving around an underwater mountain or a really gradual slope. Instead of going up and down, you're basically following the contours of the terrain.
So you're working smarter, not harder, matching your dive profile to what's already there naturally. It never ceases to amaze me how much strategy goes into planning a safe dive. I mean, it's more like, I don't know, it's like a game of underwater chess almost.
It's true, there's a lot to consider, but that's part of the fun, right? And speaking of things to consider, we've talked about those recommended profiles, those like safer routes, but your research also dug up some profiles that are kind of, well, let's just say they're not recommended for a reason.
Right, the path's less traveled, and for good reason, as I'm starting to understand. So what makes these non-recommended profiles so risky? What should we be watching out for?
Well, it all goes back to how our bodies react to those rapid pressure changes. Remember those nitrogen molecules we talked about? If you ascend too quickly, those molecules can come out of solution in your body and form bubbles. Like shaking a soda bottle, you release that pressure too fast and boom.
You end up with a fizzy mess. And in this case, that fizzy mess is decompression sickness.
Exactly. And it's not something to mess around with. You know, the symptoms, they can range from mild joint pain to, in severe cases, it can even be fatal.
Wow. I'll admit, for the longest time, I thought the bends was just like, a bad case of joint pain. Never really put two and two together about those nitrogen bubbles.
It's a common misconception, unfortunately. But yeah, decompression sickness, it's serious business. And those non-recommended dive profiles, they kind of increase your risk factor just by their very nature.
So let's dive into those, I guess, caution tape profiles. Starting with Profile D, you've got it flagged as the roller coaster in your notes. What makes it so potentially nausea-inducing?
Okay, picture this. You make a fast descent, spend some time at the bottom, and then shoot straight back up to the surface like a rocket.
So the exact opposite of that slow and steady approach we were talking about earlier.
Yep, and that rapid ascent, especially after being at depth, it just doesn't give your body enough time to get rid of that excess nitrogen safely.
So it's like holding your breath for too long, but instead of oxygen, we're talking about excess nitrogen in our system.
Yeah.
Not a good situation to be in, especially underwater.
Exactly. And, the data backs this up. Profile D, statistically speaking, it's been linked to a significantly higher percentage of decompression sickness cases, even if a diver manages to stay within their time and depth limits.
It's not just about the the depth and the time, but the how you get there and back. It really highlights that there's so much more to safe diving than meets the eye.
Okay, so if profile D is the roller coaster, what about profile E? It looks like you've got that one marked as a potential recipe for air trouble.
Yeah, Profile E, this one's tricky because it kind of combines a couple of things that individually might not be as risky, but together, well, they increase the potential for problems. Basically, it involves a stepped descent, kind of like what we talked about with Profile C.
Right, like going down a staircase.
Right. But then, instead of that staged descent, it's a rapid vertical ascent straight back to the surface.
Okay, so we're mixing a slower descent with a rapid ascent. What's the issue there?
So two things. First off, the deeper you go, the more air you use up just because of the pressure. So by the time you get to the end of your dive, you could be running lower on air than you'd like, especially with those deeper steps.
Okay, so you're low on air deep down and then you bolt to the surface. Not a good combo. Not at all. And then to make matters worse, you've got that rapid ascent, which, like we've been saying, messes with your nitrogen levels. It's like trying to win a race by pushing really hard at the start and then tripping right before the finish line.
And this brings us to Profile F. Am I right in thinking this is the one where you're basically yo-yoing up and down like you can't make up your mind?
Yeah, that's the one. Multiple ascents and descents. Sometimes it's intentional, like if you're trying to explore a bunch of different depths or something, but a lot of times it's unintentional, like, you're swimming along and you see something cool and you're like, oh, I gotta go check that out, and then you end up going back down.
I can totally see that happening, that squirrel moment underwater.
Exactly. And it can be tempting, especially when you're surrounded by so much to see. But the problem is all those ups and downs, they really mess with your body's ability to process that nitrogen effectively. It's like, imagine you're on a roller coaster, but instead of a smooth ride, it's just a series of jerky starts and stops, constantly changing directions. It's a recipe for disaster.
Makes you feel queasy just thinking about it.
Right. And that's what can happen with your nitrogen levels if you're constantly changing depths.
So looking at all of these different profiles, it really highlights just how much goes into planning a safe dive and how crucial it is to, like, really think things through and anticipate those potential risks.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that even small changes in your dive profile can make a big difference in terms of safety.
It's not just about the numbers, about hitting certain depths or staying down for a specific amount of time. It's about understanding the why behind those numbers, the how.
Right, and that's what makes this whole discussion so fascinating because it's not just about diving. It's about those broader principles of decision making, of risk assessment that we encounter in so many areas of life.
It's funny you should say that because I was just thinking the same thing. This whole concept of a dive profile, it's almost like a metaphor for how we approach, well, pretty much anything when you think about it.
It's about understanding the path, the journey, and recognizing that sometimes a slower, more deliberate approach can actually get you where you want to go more safely and ultimately more enjoyably.
It's about being mindful, aware of the potential consequences of our choices, even those seemingly small, in-the-moment decisions that can have a ripple effect down the line.
Exactly. And it's about finding that balance between pushing our limits and respecting our boundaries both physically and metaphorically.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of dive profiles, I guess the question for our listeners is, what kind of diver are you? Are you a risk taker, always pushing for those deeper depths and longer bottom times, even if it means a bit of a bumpy ride? Or do you prefer a more conservative approach, a slow and steady ascent, always keeping safety top of mind?
And most importantly, no matter what kind of diver you are, the key is to be informed, to understand the potential risks and benefits of different approaches.
So do your research, plan your dives carefully, and always remember it's not just about getting there, it's about enjoying the journey safely and responsibly.